Good afternoon. I'm Bob Wisdom, a member of the Board of Directors of the Center for Rural Strategies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Rural Assembly Everywhere. This is the first virtual gathering of the Rural Assembly. In 5 days, we hope to inspire, inform, entertain, and demonstrate what it means to build Assembly Everywhere is of this moment. It's a response to the coronavirus pandemic, to the movement for racial justice, to our rapidly changing climate. It's what we need to do in 2020. 2020, the year of despair for so many, and the year of reckoning and awakening for many, many others. The challenges we face are complex, historic, and global. And rural America must be a valuable source of responses to these situations. Day one will be brought to you by the Daily Yonder. And today we will hear about health, community life, and voting. And later this afternoon, you'll have the opportunity to join a breakout session for a deep dive into topics of justice and equity in rural America. We kick off Rural Assembly Everywhere with a conversation between two leaders in the world of philanthropy and public health. Dr. Richard Besser, President and CEO of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and former acting director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Besser will be joined by Ligia Cravo, Senior Program Officer with the Hearst Foundation. Ms. Cravo is an innovator in the field of philanthropy, and she is also my colleague on the Board of Directors of Rural Strategies. We're so glad that you decided to make this event part of your week. We ask you, keep it rural. Enjoy yourself.
So I would really like to start by thanking Bob for this inspiring kickoff of our 2020 Rural Assembly. Bob, you're definitely the rock star on our board, and we couldn't do it without you and the family, absolutely. Thank you also so much for these generous introductions. It's such an honor indeed for me to be here with Dr. Richard Besser and share a candid conversation with the more than 1,000 rural visionaries who have joined the Assembly, which I guess tells us we're quite a thirsty bunch for sharing and caring across the land. Thank you everyone for being here. And so Rich, I really can't think of anyone more qualified to comment and reflect on the disparities that have so long affected our rural communities and which are now more exposed than ever due to the pandemic. And I know that you share this Assembly's, have always shared this Assembly's commitment to working together to build a more just and inclusive nation where prosperity is driven not just by equality, but also equity. What can we learn from this moment in our history about building a nation that really values all of the people in all of the places throughout their entire lifespan? And would you also comment on why it's important to understand the difference between equality and equity to achieve this objective?
Yeah, well, thanks, Ligia. It is truly an honor to be here with this group that cares so much about rural health, about health justice, about the issues that are right now in the news every single day. One of the things about this moment that I hope is not missed is the potential for incredible transformation. You know, we're faced with this health crisis, this pandemic that's unlike anything in our lifetimes. You know, I've never seen a health crisis of this magnitude. At the same time, we're having an economic crisis that is just shining a light on the disparities and the inequities across our country. And added to that is an incredible movement across the country for racial justice.
Yes.
And the occurrence of all three of those at the same time gives us an opportunity to think about what kind of society we want to have. And the question you raised about equity versus equality is an important one, and one at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We spent a lot of time thinking about, talking about, figuring out, well, how do you shine a light on that and explain the difference. In a setting of equality, everyone is given the same thing, and you can say, well, yeah, that makes sense. Give everyone the same thing, and then see how things play out. Unfortunately, if you take that approach, you ignore the fact that different people have different needs, and for many different reasons. There are so many in our society who have faced historical barriers over generations and generations, hundreds of years of barriers based on racism and sexism, ableism, that if you don't account for that and you give everyone the same thing, then you will continue to see major disparities, major differences. And one of the things that this pandemic, I think, serves to do is shine a bright light on how that plays out. And I spend a lot of time talking about how it plays out in terms of disparate impact, disproportionate impact on Black Americans, Latino Americans, Native Americans, who are being infected and hospitalized and dying at rates that far surpass their proportion of the population. And so much has to do with exposure risk. A higher proportion of people of color work in essential occupations. They work in healthcare, frontline healthcare workers and home healthcare workers, and working in food production and manufacturing and transportation and first responders. And those are not occupations that you can do, like I can do my job sitting here in my basement remotely. And so you've got an increased risk of exposure. And as a society, we haven't provided everyone with the protections that they need to ensure that the risk is reduced as low as possible. We also haven't reflected on the fact that many people are unable to follow the guidance that public health is putting forward. I was really blown away, Leisha, by the CDC guidance around what to do if you think you're sick. And what they said was, well, don't go to the hospital or healthcare center. Call your doctor. Well, at the start of this pandemic, 28 million people in America lacked health insurance.
That's right.
And a greater proportion of people in rural communities lacked health insurance. So who are you going to call if you don't have health insurance? What they recommended is, if you think you had COVID or you're diagnosed, that you stay home in a room away from other people, use your own bathroom. Well, if you live in a multi-generational household, and again, a higher proportion of people in rural communities live in multi-generational households, then you've got COVID and you're likely to infect somebody in your home. And if you live in a household with people who may have underlying medical conditions or disabilities that put them at greater risk, you're again going to be infecting people who are at greater risk. And as you know, people in rural communities, over 50% have chronic medical conditions. So if you're not recognizing that different people, different communities have different needs, and you're saying everyone do the same thing, you are by nature disadvantaging large sectors of our population.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And added to it, I guess, the confluence of also often disparate information from federal to state has definitely left us without as uniform a response as we likely would have all wanted. But you touch on an important issue, many important issues for rural communities, where in fact, since August, the higher incidence has been in rural America of cases, with some of our counties really having the very highest incidence. And today, again, the numbers as reported are up. And I wonder if you might comment on how, as I know you're a data lover and an evidence-driven champion, with all the data we are now collecting on COVID, again, why is it so important to have all this specificity of this data to ensure that equity? And also, how do you think that this philosophy, belief system of pulling yourself by your bootstraps that is baked into our DNA really has impacted our ability to have a more universal public health system? As you've pointed out, I mean, many of us are just doomed to be born in zip codes that have chronic structural disparities. And the idea that you could get straps, let alone boots, just seems absolutely out of sync. So how can data help us change this false narrative?
I smiled when you said I'm a data lover, because I am. I'm a pediatrician, and I'm also an epidemiologist and trained at the CDC, and know the power of good data to drive action. You know, data that's just collected to say, wow, look at this, I find really kind of stifling. But data that's used for purpose, for action, can be really empowering. But one of the things that's so important to recognize is that, you know, data is not apolitical. Data has perspective, and if you're not collecting, you know, what data you collect says a lot about what you care about and who you value. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've done as a foundation is lay out principles for equitable response and recovery for local officials. And the first principle we call out is the incredible importance of collecting data that will allow you to look across your communities by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, by zip code, by disability. You know, all of these factors we know from specific studies have a relation to how well you're going to do with this pandemic, or how well you'll do in other health situations. But if you're not looking at things by zip code, and you can't pull out your rural communities and compare those to other communities, you may miss something big. You may miss a community that is not being well served by testing sites. You know, I'm on the Restart and Recovery Commission here in New Jersey. And one of the things we've been able to see by looking at data by zip code is specific neighborhoods that lack access to testing. And then you can target that and address that. And if you're a state that is like so many states, mixed rural and urban, and you're just looking at your statewide numbers, they may look really good. But if you're not being able to break it down to say, well, let's look at our rural counties and what's happening there, you may miss counties that lack the broadband connection to be able to do telehealth, or may be missing the access to hospitals that have intensive care units that will lead to better outcomes with disease. So data is really, really important, and it's important that at the federal, state, and local level, data is collected so you're able to look at things down to those levels. Because if you don't do that, one, it's you're going to miss problems and opportunities to save lives, but it says a lot about who you value and who you see fully. And you know, at a time of crisis, I think there's probably nothing more devastating than to feel that you are not seen, that you don't have value, that your government and your representatives and your public health system doesn't care about you. That can be incredibly debilitating in terms of, you know, mental and emotional health.
Couldn't agree more. Again, and another sort of thought in relation to all of this is, of course, the role of the media and journalism, and you spent almost 7 years in that role as well. How do you think that the media and journalists may, in fact, play a very positive role in informing our communities and influencing, best practices in public health, government, and so on? And I want to give a big shout out here actually to our very own Daily Yonder publication, because they've done an extraordinary job of covering the pandemic, and at a time when, as you well know, there are fewer and fewer local newspapers. And the fact that, frankly, membership is like increased by 2/3, readership rather, since March, is very heartwarming, because it means to me that people are thirsty for truth-telling information. So what are your thoughts about the roles that could be played?
Yeah, it's when I think about media, it's another one of those things where you have to break it down to be able to really see the good and the bad. And I see so much written that paints media with a broad brush as media is part of the problem. Media is also really part of the solution. And the loss of small town local newspapers is really challenging for a lot of places. It's the fabric that can hold a community together and let you see and understand your neighbors as people, as individuals. And we're losing a lot of that. Daily Yonder is doing a great job at calling out the incredibly high rates that we're seeing now in rural communities. And those are stories that are not making the national news to the extent they should. You hear, well, the pandemic is spreading to Midwest, states. It's like, let's break it down a little more. Yes, it is. One thing about the virus is it doesn't care where you live. It doesn't affect every community at the same time, but it will affect every community. And if you're not able to call that out, and local papers are one way that you can do that. And you're seeing online replacements for some of that. There's been great investigative journalism that has called out issues of politicization of public health. That's really, really important. You see a lot of websites that are replacing some of the traditional roles that government has done, and some of those are media websites where different media outlets are tracking cases by race and ethnicity and gender and things that you're not seeing on our governmental websites. But you also see a downside from some of the broadcast media outlets where they're contributing to the politicization of this. When I was at CDC for 13 years, and for 4 of those years, I led emergency preparedness and response. And during public health crises, we tried as hard as we could to keep politics out. And we viewed it as a true success factor if we could get bipartisan support for the public health response. And there was a period here during this pandemic early on when you saw Congress come together and pass the CARES Act almost unanimously. And that provided incredible support to a lot of people. It recognized that people needed money in their pockets to be able to put food on the table and to pay their rent. And it gave supplemental support for unemployment insurance and protection against eviction and mortgage foreclosure. And all kinds of things that are in there that have now, lapsed. But there was that period early on where I was thinking, wow, maybe Congress can hold it together. But clearly that hasn't happened. And media feeds into that. I spend a lot of time now because of the role that I'd had at ABC. I'm very comfortable talking about science and health to the general public. And so, I'm on media outlets across the political spectrum. And what I hear on them is really, unfortunately, a lot of feeding the flames of, the political divide, rather than looking to say, hey, how do we address concerns? If some people are concerned about wearing masks and about social distancing, let's try and understand why that's the case and address those concerns. But it's so challenging when you see this, you see such discordant messaging between public health and the leaders at the federal level.
Yeah. Again, very much in agreement, but also I'd say I'm a bit of a viral optimist, so I need to have great hope in what's ahead. And in fact, one of my big hopes, and I'd love to hear what your thinking is in that regard, is a moment when we shall have a public health system that really supports community health workers, and that, and that means at federal and every level. I just read, I don't know if it was University of Pennsylvania, some, really critical piece of research commenting on the fact that if even just a third of our Medicaid patients were benefiting from community health outreach programs, more than $80 billion could be saved. Not to mention the quality of their health and their care would be so tremendously higher. So that's one of the silver linings I'm hopeful for, but would love to hear from your angle as an expert in public health.
Well, you're an expert as well, and I think what you lay out does give a path forward that's that we should be hopeful about. In these moments that are so challenging, I am optimistic that it will allow new approaches, novel ideas, innovation to rise up that will gain traction, and that will save lives. The Affordable Care Act allowed for the expansion of Medicaid, and we know in the states that expanded Medicaid that it greatly helped the entire state, but rural communities in particular. There have been 170 rural hospitals that have closed since 2005. And with each closure of a rural hospital, what research shows is that there's a 6% increase in mortality in the surrounding communities. And that's before a pandemic. With this pandemic, we've done survey work with Harvard School of Public Health and NPR, looking at the impact. And what we saw there is that 1 in 4 rural households had someone with a serious medical condition who was unable to receive care during the pandemic. And that those individuals, the majority of them suffered dire consequences because of that. And so, this is a time to look at new approaches. One is, the Affordable Care Act allows states to expand Medicaid. 12 states haven't done so. Those states have large rural populations. Those, people in those states need to push their governors, push their legislatures to say, hey, we need to expand Medicaid. That's a plus. Your comment about community health workers, I think, is spot on as well. At the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we have a program called Global Solutions to U.S. Problems, and this is one of those situations where there's so much we can learn from the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the model of community health workers isn't new, and it's shown to be incredibly effective. When I was in Liberia in 2014 during the Ebola pandemic,
that's right,
I got to know an incredible health leader named Raj Punjabi, who runs a program called Last Mile Health. And he's based out of Boston. He's from Liberia. But it's all about getting healthcare to the people who are in that last mile furthest from your health center, from your hospital. Absolutely. And it's all based on community health workers and what they can provide. And early in my career, I spent a year working in Bangladesh, and I was assigned there to work for a group called the Urban Volunteer Program. And it was a program of community health workers that were going into slums in Dhaka, Bangladesh, to provide services. And they were all women. They were not trained, they had no formal education in health, but they were taught to provide basic health services, to identify problems. And what the model of that program showed was that it improved the health outcomes for the people in those communities. So there's a lot of innovation that hopefully will gain traction during this crisis.
Which is really exciting. And that's really what does not keep me up at night, because I try to go to sleep thinking on the positive side. And I was also curious as to how we might, as a sector, collaborate together a little better, because I often feel like we're all like in disparate and yet united goals in our work. And what are some of the initiatives that, for example, you are working on at Robert Wood Johnson that should aggregate more funders like ourselves, possibly? We do try to be very mindful of providing support for free clinics, mobile units, rural, a lot of emphasis also on supporting minorities to enter the field at undergraduate and graduate levels. But I feel that we are perhaps missing an opportunity to be more leveraged together.
Yeah, it's. I think that's right. I think that funders coming together is really important and can definitely help with grantees not being pulled in many different directions based on the prevailing winds of funders. One of the things that we're really excited about and interested in at the foundation is the whole area of community power. And recognizing that people in communities, those closest to the inequities, those whose lives are impacted the greatest, are in the best position to identify solutions and to work for those solutions. And rather than us in Princeton, New Jersey, saying, "Here's the answer to your problem." It's saying, what can we do to help you be more effective in implementing the solutions that you see? And I'm really excited about this shift in thinking. And it goes with this moment in time where we're seeing so much grassroots activity around the country addressing issues of racial justice. How do we capitalize on that moment and say, how do we seed power and say that it's critically important that the ideas that are coming up lead to real structural and systemic change in America. You were talking before about people lifting themselves up by their bootstraps. The other analogy that's used all the time is that a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, what if you don't have a boat? Yeah, what if you're not in a boat? Are you getting raised up? And so there's this myth in America of this being the land of opportunity, and that anyone, by working hard enough, can do it. And one of the downsides of storytelling is that you can find examples of that, of people who have overcome incredible hurdles to achieve exceptional outcomes in their lives. But that plays against the norm of people who have incredible dreams and aspirations. And if as a society we could remove barriers, it could be incredible what blossoms from that.
Absolutely. And I think it also intersects with our notion that people don't know what's best for themselves. And I think we've seen time and again that when you provide the quality of life that we can all have, where there's clean water, safety, housing, etc., people make the very best choices for themselves time and again. So moving this narrative outside of our historical roots would be transformative, I think, for the country, not just across health, but all of our issues of equity. And so I wanted to also ask you, because it's so topical, about the vaccine issue. And as I said before, I am a viral optimist. I know there will be a vaccine and it will be an effective one at some point. But I'm also, I guess, a middle-aged pragmatic with concerns about the distribution of how this vaccine will be held, especially in rural communities, which already have such an infrastructure issue. Are you aware of any mechanisms that are already being designed by health officials for vaccine distribution? And does that give you some confidence? Or there's nothing really in place yet?
Yeah, I think it's a critically important issue in terms of vaccine. There's several issues in terms of vaccine. One is, I'm an optimist as well, and with the amount of investment going into vaccines, I'm hopeful that there will be one. But I think that the narrative around vaccines right now is that there definitely will be one.
Yeah.
And that is really dangerous. When you think about some of the biggest infectious disease challenges we've faced as a globe, HIV, malaria, TB, dengue fever, hepatitis C. Scientists have been working for decades to develop vaccines, and we don't have one for any of those diseases that's safe and effective. And so while there are many vaccine candidates that are in trials, in phase 3 trials, there's absolutely no guarantee that any of them will be safe and effective. And if they are effective, how effective they'll be. So, it's so important that people right now follow the guidance of public health and wear masks and social distance and hand wash and do what they can to protect not just themselves, but those around them. If there's a vaccine, and again, I'm hopeful there will be, the vaccine distribution issues that you raise are really, really important. Vaccine distribution is key. Trust in the vaccine is also key. And when you look at the polling data right now, there are a very high percentage of people in America would not want to receive a vaccine if one was licensed right now. And there's several reasons. One is the politicization of science and concern that political fingerprints are all over the FDA and CDC. And we have to ensure that everything's being done possible to allow those agencies to do their work unfettered. Because without that, I wouldn't want a vaccine. I want to know that an independent body of scientists has worked and made their recommendation to FDA, and that FDA had the authority to decide whether to approve that. And CDC, through its work with the ACIP, which is the committee on immunization practices, it's the advisory committee on immunization practices that sets the recommendations, that they're able to do that in an unfettered way. So assuming all that happens, and I'm an optimist saying that America won't stand for those for political interference in those bodies. Distribution is key, and I've been on many conversations around distribution. States are required to get their plans to CDC around distribution this week, and they will all be reviewed. And there are a lot of challenges. It depends somewhat on what kind of vaccine becomes available. One of the candidate vaccines needs to be stored at -70 degrees Celsius. Well, big challenges on that for rural communities. What it requires is centralized vaccine administration, because you will not be able to take that out to small clinics and maintain that temperature. And so, there has to be deep thinking about how do you reach rural populations for that vaccine. The first vaccines that come available will be for adults, not for children. And a lot of our vaccine distribution systems in America are built around the Vaccine for Children program, because most vaccinations are for children. So you have to make sure you're adapting to say, okay, how do you reach adults, and how do you reach all adults? A higher proportion of people in rural communities lack health insurance, and you don't want someone's insurance status to determine whether or not they have accessibility to a vaccine. And you don't want someone's immigration status, documentation status to be a factor. You want to make sure that migrant workers have access to vaccines. So there's a lot of things that are being discussed, and that's terrific, because this is the time to nail that down. It's the time as well, though, to ramp up the engagement with each community. There's been real challenges in getting African Americans to participate in vaccine trials because of longstanding distrust with the public health community based on abuse of populations and communities. So you have to engage with trusted leaders so that if there's a vaccine, I've heard it said time and time again that vaccines don't save lives, vaccination saves lives. And so you could have a vaccine, if no one wants to receive it, you're not going to have any impact on this pandemic.
That's right.
These are, and people in rural communities know what they need to, they know what their concerns are, they know what's necessary in terms of getting access to healthcare, and it's engagement and listening, and then providing the resources to address the concerns and the needs of each community.
Absolutely. And again, I keep going back to the concept of community health workers, because they could play such a critical role in this process, both in having the trust of the people in their community, being educators. And of course, that's also the impact on job creation would be so timely, so very timely. But I appreciate you're always very absolutely factual and sobering comments, because I did so much work in the 80s around the HIV pandemic in New York City. And you're so right. I mean, let's think about all these incredible problems we still have not come up with vaccines for. So as aspirational as I want to be and think everyone should be, it's good to have this in the back of your head that for the moment, the power is in our behavior, not in some miracle drug that doesn't exist. And I think we're going to be running out of time, and I want to be mindful of our framework. But I believe in young people as the future of this world. Naturally, they are. And I wonder if you might have any advice for young people going into the various fields of healthcare, and how they, why they should also think more intentionally about rural in our country. We at Hearst are doing some work around that, but I would love to hear from you as well as an expert.
Yeah, well, I also have faith in young people, and I have to say at the foundation that some of our newer, younger employees come in with fresh ideas and different perspectives, and the idea of not accepting what is for what needs to be, and this idea that now let's challenge what is with a new way is really important. I think we at the foundation, we're big supporters of universal health care, and there are many ways to get there. And I think that one of the solutions to getting young people to think about practicing healthcare in rural communities is to provide opportunity. And if we had universal health care, people from rural communities who recognize the strength, the joy of rural life and rural lifestyle, that sense of community, that sense of resilience. When I've gotten out, each year we give culture of health prizes, which recognize communities that are coming together towards building a culture of health, recognizing that health is about what takes place in communities. As I've gotten out to visit some rural communities that have won those prizes, I'm just blown away by the sense of community, the sense of joy in the values of rural life. I think if the opportunities are there, when you have 170 hospitals closing, it gets much harder for someone who wants to practice in a rural setting to do so. But if everyone was to have health insurance, if everyone was to have access to high quality, affordable healthcare, and if we were paying the healthcare system for health rather than for treating disease, then we would see more support for community health centers, more support for community health workers. And that would provide opportunity for people who really want to stay in rural settings to do so.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And my last, it's a very selfish curiosity question, because I am so enjoying your book, and I know this is not a PR moment, but here it is. I'm just curious, and I love it because you cover in very factual, plain language questions that we all ask ourselves, like, what do I do if I think I'm having a stroke? Can I take medication that's long expired? Do people really die of a broken heart? I mean, I love the disparate issues that are covered. And since the book was published pre-COVID, I wonder if there's a revision, a revised edition in the plan that will take us through COVID.
Well, no, I mean, thank you for that. There isn't. That book was I wrote that with my wife, Jeannie Besser, who's a food writer, and
that's great.
It was really fun to write that together. But no, my focus now at the foundation is somewhat different. I wrote that book when I was at ABC News, and there. My role was to provide, clear, factual information to the public so that people could make better health choices. It was much more focused around an individual model of health. And at the foundation, our focus is much more, yes, the choices you make really matter, but the choices you make depend on the choices you have. And our focus at the foundation is to really lift that up and say, how do we ensure that everyone in America has the opportunity to make healthy choices, that every community in America is a community that allows health to thrive. And if we can help shift some of that during COVID and post-COVID, I think we will truly have a more equitable nation and more equitable world. It's been a real pleasure.
Amen. Likewise, what a pleasure. And I look forward to collaborating on future work. And thank you again so much for the time to be with this precious assembly that is just kicking off. And I hope you'll stay tuned.
Thank you. I wish all of those attending well. I'm sure it's going to be a great event.
Thank you so much, Rich. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Some people wear masks to protect themselves. Others wear masks to protect their loved ones. But if we all wore masks, perhaps we could return to our much more interesting lives. Stay healthy, my friends.
Hi, my name is Tim Marima, and I'm the editor of the Daily Yonder at dailyyonder.com. On behalf of the staff and volunteers who produce the Daily Yonder, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Yonder Day at Rural Assembly everywhere. The Daily Yonder and the Rural Assembly both originated roughly the same time in 2007, and that's not a coincidence. Each of us was part of a larger effort to raise awareness about rural issues, bring people together to talk about them, and provide information that's critical for people who are working on policy and other issues. We're both today part of the Center for Rural Strategies, and the Yonder focuses on providing information for people who care about rural America. And I've never experienced a group of people who demonstrate that better than people who participate in the Rural Assembly. So we're so happy to be part of this day. You can find coverage of the Rural Assembly on our website at www.dailyyonder.com. Today, we've just heard from Richard Besser, who told us about some of the issues in rural America that have been exacerbated and highlighted by the pandemic. And many of these have been brought to a moment of crisis. It's appropriate that we study this because rural America now has a higher incidence of COVID-19 than metropolitan areas do in terms of new infections. Nobody is getting a pass on COVID-19. I was curious about how rural healthcare providers are holding up under these conditions, what efforts they're taking to address the pandemic, whether it's working, and whether rural leaders are providing the leadership and whether the resources are there for them to respond. And I can think of no better source for that kind of information than the National Rural Health Association. They have members all over the country, and they also work at a national level on rural health policy. So I reached out to Alan Morgan, the CEO of the National Rural Health Association, and asked him to help me look at what's happening in rural communities.
Through this crisis, as I've talked with national media, I've been very careful not to be an alarmist about this. And in hindsight, I now realize that was the wrong approach, flat out. From a public health perspective, COVID in rural America is a horror story. It is the worst possible setup that we could possibly design. You've got communities with high percentages of elderly. Obesity is at a higher rate in rural populations, with a lot of chronic health issues. Clustered in these hundreds of small towns all across the US are populations most at risk for COVID, and they're going to Walmart, Dollar General, the church. They're gathering together. It's a tinderbox just waiting for the COVID match to be thrown into it. And unfortunately, when urban people talk about rural America, they're envisioning the farmer and rancher out in western Nebraska or western Kansas. And those guys pioneered the concept of social isolation. They've got social distancing down. What we're talking about is elderly with comorbidities, hundreds of them clustered all across the US, and not adhering to wearing masks or social distancing and thinking because they're seen on TV that everything is okay. This has to be changed. The global pandemic that we're all facing right now put a magnifying glass on many of the inequities and barriers to care that we had in rural communities across the US. It's emphasized it, if you would. And on one hand, it's really been a challenge, but on the other hand, there are positives. I know it's hard to believe, but there are positives. Most notably in how we're delivering care and the relaxation of telehealth rules and regulations, the dramatic expansion of telehealth, And one thing that's not received a lot of press is the expansion of health providers collaborating and coordinating together in a team approach that's been forced upon a lot of these rural hospitals. And this pandemic just was a great equalizer, regardless of whether you're a rural hospital doing poorly and struggling or one that was doing financially well. It was the equalizer. We've seen 15 rural hospitals close already this year, and more than 400 are at risk for closure. In these rural communities, these rural hospitals are anchor institutions. And unfortunately, they face workforce shortages. And in that type of a situation where you've got workforce shortages, you've got rural facilities struggling to keep their doors open, and then you throw a pandemic in the mix, it's just the worst possible situation. There has been the amount of preventative patient visits into clinicians has dramatically dropped through this pandemic. Cancer screenings most notably. And here's something that can be done if you have broadband over a telephone type application.
So you're talking about the medical provider side of the broadband access, and mostly we've heard about the issues with patients, even before you get to patients, there's an issue of clinics having access. What have you heard, if anything, about how access in homes is affecting telehealth care?
Yeah, when we're talking about telehealth, we really need to realize we're operating in a completely different environment and world right now. Prior to April, when we talked about telehealth, we were talking about a cancer specialist from a large teaching facility beaming into a rural hospital to meet with patients. Now we're talking about a clinician in the rural community beaming into the home to talk to a patient. That's an entirely different environment. Now we're at the imperative where we have to have rapid expansion of broadband access for this. And what people need to realize is that the potential and the services we're talking about now have opened up.
So you also talked about collaboration. Do you have some examples of places that are doing that and what you mean by that term?
Yeah, we've seen that. I think that's probably just one of the greatest stories, and not surprising from a rural angle. Earlier this summer, when you heard on the news about the surge happening in Houston, Texas, what you didn't hear was the overflow of COVID cases happening in the rural communities adjacent to Houston. Houston had its hands full, and these rural hospitals were struggling with PPE and access to all the equipment that they needed to treat these patients. And through a collaborative effort, they were able to, from hospital to hospital, transfer in equipment and ventilators to these facilities, and then informally move them among their peers during this as the surge rolled through these rural communities. This type of collaboration among separate rural hospitals is really what makes rural America special, and it's what we would expect from all hospitals as we meet this pandemic. This sounds like what you would hear people talk about in a wistful view of what rural is. But the Institute of Medicine's landmark study, collaboration that they did way back in the 90s, highlighted the fact that rural healthcare is much more inclined to collaborate, communicate, network, and as a result of that, have better health outcomes.
You told me that you'd been out to Missouri recently. Where did you go? What did you do? And what did you see there?
I got out to that community, Memphis, Missouri. Beautiful community, wonderful. I was dumbfounded. No one was wearing masks. I was the only one in town wearing masks. And as I got to the hospital, I heard the unfortunate news that they, at that very time, were experiencing an uptick in positive cases, and they actually had hospitalizations, and they were talking about potential referring patients on. And that is just such a cautionary tale of how rural communities need to view this crisis as we're going ahead. When your roof is on fire, Tim, that is not the time to be installing smoke alarms. People need to be prepared for this and know that being prepared on the front end is going to prevent this on the back end.
Is there an issue or topic or idea that I didn't ask you about that you think needs to be included in this conversation? As
we focus on all the issues and concerns about COVID and how we deal with that and keep the focus on COVID, at the same time, we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and realize that we are now in the middle of possibly the greatest behavioral health crisis that we've seen as a nation. And we have to be able to focus on both together. Unfortunately, I don't think the behavioral health component is getting the attention that it needs. One of the most beneficial ways of dealing with this is through telebehavioral health. And so on one hand, as we see this tremendous crisis growing, we really are well positioned from the telehealth perspective of it to hopefully connect the healthcare providers with the patients in need. But it's going to need to have a recognition of this and really a public affairs campaign where patients and community members know that there is a resource for them locally. They shouldn't hesitate to contact their primary care clinician about that, and they can put them in touch with this. You cannot diminish the impact that this crisis is having on behavioral health concerns.
The American public thinks of rural issues as some sort of monolith. We have no real awareness of the communities that live and thrive in rural communities around the country. And I think reporting that is, not coming from the cities or from publications that are based in New York or LA only is really important in changing that debate and changing perceptions. Some of the stories that I've been editing have to do with the role of the Postal Service in small communities in Arizona. I've also been editing work about the conditions of migrant farm workers during the pandemic. Most recently, I edited a piece about movement to stop a private immigrant detention facility from going up in Wyoming. So these are all stories that basically challenge the stereotypes that a lot of the American public has about rural communities and who lives there and what happens there. I'm excited because I see a change happening among people in our industry and among young journalists in particular, and wanting to change that narrative. But specifically at High Country News, the magazine where I am a contributing editor, there's a real mandate to cover rural communities more and to do right by them at this moment in time when there's such a discussion about racial justice, about public health, about the impact of the election. So thank you so much for having me, and onwards.
As a journalist, a technologist, and a mom, I spent a lot of time looking at the digital lives of rural communities, especially children, looking at who is harmed, who benefits, who is susceptible, and to what. I'm deeply concerned about the coalescing of QAnon, militias, and far-right extremism, accelerationism. In regards to QAnon, the pandemic, against a lot of other structural instability online and in real life, has provided a perfect storm for people to coalesce around that narrative. I mean, it reads like a hypnotic soap opera whose plot points are delivered as electric doses of dopamine through addictive technology. I would bet everyone listening to this knows someone who is somewhere on the spectrum of this buffet of conspiracies, which means it's not a they problem, it's an us problem. school teachers, nurses and neighbors, moms, conservatives and liberals alike. QAnon has managed to exploit latent fears of so many Americans. And while white supremacist origin and aims are essential to its dangerous rhetoric, we also observe that it is increasingly a diverse movement, unifying groups around a lack of trust in some form or another of institutions that have failed or betrayed them. That's a lot of people. So I'll leave you all with a thought for each of us in the coming weeks and months. A question I am asking myself daily. Are you part of a solution? Or are you part of a problem? And I want to urge local journalists to be present and really there for your communities. Report in a way that de-escalates potential conflict and violence. Don't be complicit in drama for clicks or seeking those photojournalism awards. Don't platform dangerous rhetoric no matter where it comes from. Report local solutions and the good work of community members ensuring safe, peaceful elections. Focus on stability, not chaos, whenever and wherever you can.
I've been working at the Center for Rural Strategies for almost 3 months now, and I still don't really know what rural means.
Rural America is a Rorschach ink blot test.
Let's say there are two kinds of rural. There's like a rural of the head and a rural of the heart. Rural people and rural places are real important to me.
I think of community, kindness, and warmth.
Rural is walking to the post office every morning, to visit your neighbors, to learn the latest news and gossip.
Staying within sight and sound of each other and the land.
Rural is rain on a tin roof and hoping that the power doesn't go out.
You know, they say that it's not where you are, it's who you're with. But with rural, it's where you are and who you're with.
To me, rural is a state of mind. It's a work in progress. It's a place that brings me peace, and ultimately it's home.
No one has the same answer for what rural is because the strict definitions don't really cut it.
I've seen conferences start with the speaker saying, we want to get into our program, but first let's just very quickly define what we mean by rural. And 90 minutes later, they still haven't come to any agreement on how they're going to define rural.
Rural is contradictory, kind of not consistent.
Rural is coveting your neighbor's camper.
Potter Stewart, the justice, said about obscenity. I don't know have a definition, but I know it when I see it.
I mean, it's the glacier lakes of the Adirondacks where you're spending some time in your old age, but it's also the coal fields of central Appalachia and industrial rural where you grew up.
Rural is going around the mountain to visit your cousins before the strip mine took it all away.
You can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy.
I think of neighbors being great friends. I think of local politicians knowing their constituents on a first-name basis.
Rural is making it work.
Rural is kind of just a vibe.
You're always going to leave something out, and someone is always going to have a, well, what about this question? And they're probably right.
We are the Rural Assembly.
We are the Rural Assembly.
We are the Rural Assembly.
Building a more inclusive nation.
Building a more inclusive nation.
Building a more inclusive nation.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Dwight Langham, Center for Rural Strategies Board Treasurer, and I guess I got this gig because I'm located here in DC. I am joined today by my 10th grade daughter, Indira, and my 12th grade son, Mandela, who are taking a break from their COVID remote studies to help me introduce our next segment.
First, thank you, Richard Besser and Leisha Kravu, for your interesting and stimulating discussion.
Politics, love them or hate them, have become a central part of our nation's dialogue. Some of us wake up in the mornings to the chatter and go to sleep at night with the buzz still ringing in our ears. That definitely happens at our house.
It used to be that rural voters' role was at best an afterthought, but the 2016 election changed all of that. It's now clear that rural people need to be better understood and heard.
Today's panel is designed to help you understand the importance of the rural vote, the issues that are important to rural people, how their votes are aligning in the current election, and the pressing need for civility in politics.
We are extremely fortunate to have this group of Washington insiders to explain it to us common folks.
Our panel moderator is Washington political consultant and communications strategist, William Greener. Mr. Greener will lead a presentation featuring Democrat pollster Celinda Lake and Republican pollster Ed Goaz, who often work together to produce battleground polls.
This is a repeat performance by Mr. Goaz and Ms. Lake, who presented together at the 2013 National Rural Assembly. Today, we expect them to
discuss the 2020 presidential race, who's up, who's down, what to expect, and what may surprise us.
Look at the best data on the 2020 Senate and House races.
And finally, share an overview on rural voters and the demographic shifts that characterize small town politics.
So sit up and get ready to be enlightened by folks who really know how to read the tea leaves.
As we like to say in our house, ignorance is not an option.
So go. Am I up, Joel? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this virtual political update. My name is Bill Greener. You're going to be hearing from two people a lot smarter than me. I greet you from my 1830 farmhouse here. And you're going to hear from Celinda Lake, who is at an airport and hence the mask, and Ed Goaz, who's in Alexandria, Virginia, recovering from a recent surgery. Our nation has never been so divided, at least in my political lifetime. And if nothing else gets accomplished here today, I'm hoping that you're going to have the opportunity to listen to two very smart people and see how people with strong views can be civilized in their discourse and respectful of one another. And the way we're going to do this is after I'm done with this little brief introduction, Celinda's going to talk for 10 minutes. Then Ed's going to talk for 10 minutes. And then we're going to take 20 minutes of your questions. So I don't think there's any reason to slow the train down. So I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to Celinda.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you so much for having both of us. And I apologize for the little bit of muffled sound. And I appreciate so much your insight. You're way too modest. And there is no better pollster and no better friend and colleague than Ed Goaz. So I always makes my day to do something with him and his smart insights. So what we're focused on today is the rural vote as we come down to the final hours of the campaign. And of course, as you'll remember, the rural vote for the Democrats has been deteriorating. 2008, we did much, much better. We've never won the rural vote, but did better than in 2012, where we did better than in 2016. And 2016 showed a record gap in the rural area, 61% for Trump, 34% for Clinton. This year, we're seeing a couple of things. We're seeing the rural vote still voting very much Republican and for Trump, but not by the kinds of margins that we saw before. We're seeing Fox News, for example, 54% for Trump, 41% for Biden. So the more you narrow that gap, the more the cities and the suburbia can make up for the difference. We're also seeing some gender gap in rural areas, particularly rural areas that are hard hit by COVID. And we're seeing the rural areas also not as COVID not as salient as the cities and the suburbs, but still people pretty critical in the suburbs, in the rural areas of the president's handling of the pandemic. And on most issues, about 2/3 of the voters approve of the job the president is doing. When it comes to the pandemic, it's only 56% approve, which is much lower. We also have a secret vote in the rural areas that people don't talk about as much, and that is the senior vote. And of course, rural America is older on average. And Joe Biden is doing much, much better with seniors than Democrats have done since before 2004, frankly. And we have a good shot at tying or slightly winning seniors. And that impacts the rural vote as well, because a lot of those seniors live in the rural areas. The thing that helps Trump in the rural areas, besides kind of cultural affinity and just a positive feeling, and Ed will talk a lot more about this, but is the economy. People do think in rural areas that Trump will be better on the economy. The farmers are, frankly, and I say this as a daughter of a farmer and a rancher, remarkably forgiving about the trade wars, responsive to the aid that has been delivered, and just in general think a businessman has good ideas on the economy, and that trade under Democrats was not that good for farmers. So the economy really holds, and economic recovery really holds up Trump's support in rural areas. The things that bother rural voters more are his handling of COVID, as we mentioned, and they also don't trust Trump on COVID very much. They do think he should have a plan, he should listen more to the scientists, and a lot of ag families very, very involved with the science of cultivating and very science-oriented, actually. People don't realize this. There's also some tension around Donald Trump's style. And rural voters like a lot Trump's tell it like it is, you know where he stands kind of approach to things, that he's not a career politician. On the other hand, rural voters tend to be very respectful of each other and value that. I remember a tale from my childhood when my dad said, well, now we have to work with our neighbors, Mr. Miles, to do the fence. And I said, little pipsqueak that I said, well, I thought we didn't like Mr. Miles. And my dad said, well, first of all, don't ever say that. But secondly, it doesn't matter. We're neighbors. We have to work together. And that is a very, very strong norm in rural areas. And the style that the president has, often, particularly for rural women and seniors, not a very good style. The last thing that I would say is that healthcare is a major issue in rural areas. Negotiating lower prescription drug prices, having pre-existing conditions, protecting Medicare, and expanding Social Security. All of those issues are big in rural areas, and some of them are contested. The campaigns have ads on both sides right now about Medicare, for example. So some of those issues are contested, but very, very strong issues in rural areas. The last thing I will say, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Ed, the Trump tax cuts. The Trump tax cuts, believe it or not, remarkably, rural voters think the Trump tax cuts went to big corporations and to the wealthy, and not to them, even though many, many farms and ranches are incorporated. And an attack on the Trump tax cuts threatening Social Security and Medicare appeals to 65% of rural voters. So a very, very strong argument to them, and a place where rural voters think, well, we didn't get any tax break. And then dealing with the future of our country and the kind of role model for our children. The Biden campaign has also targeted rural voters with faith ads, particularly to Catholics, but in general, and have run hard on establishing appropriately, informing the voters that he is a man of faith, and that faith has been very, very important to him in the darkest of times. And that is a message that has resonated in rural areas as well. So we won't win the rural vote, but there are a lot of indicators that we can close the gap, and that will contribute to the victory in some key states. Let me turn it back over to Ed.
Linda, before you turn it over to Ed, do you want to say anything about the handful of Senate seats that are up for grabs? And that might be a good way to pivot to Ed.
Yeah. So the rural vote is great point, Bill. The rural vote is particularly important to Senate races. And we have a lot of Senate races in states that Donald Trump is going to carry. I am not predicting that Joe Biden is going to carry my home state of Montana, for example. And the rural vote will be very, very important there. And you see the senators, the Democratic senators, targeting the rural vote and really raising questions about whether you're in touch with the rural vote or not. Have you worked for rural? Do you get rural hospitals? So they're running very, very aggressive campaigns geared toward their own platforms and backgrounds, whether it's their personal background or their agricultural and economic plan or their support for veterans and rural hospitals. You see a lot of Democratic Senate races really relying on and campaigning hard for the rural vote, and the rural vote a key vote in those areas. So thanks for raising that, Bill.
Okay, Ed, you want to pick it up?
Sure, thanks, Bill. And as Celinda also said, I love working with Celinda. We've now been doing kind of national polling together for 30 years. And quite frankly, I have more respect for her in terms of polling than any of the Republicans on our side, and certainly any of the Democrats on their side. Celinda, the one thing you can always trust with Celinda is she's going to tell you what she thinks and give you the truth as opposed to sugarcoat it. And that has perhaps gotten her in trouble before with some of the Democrats because they very often treat polling as a press release as opposed to data. But I found it very refreshing and actually helped me be a better pollster through the years. And Bill, what can I say? I mean, Bill and I have worked together forever. Probably one of the most interesting races where I think we both worked for a candidate that knew far more than we will ever know and taught us a great deal of what we know, which is Haley Barbour down in Mississippi. I come from it, and part of the reason why Bill mentioned the Senate is my wife is Joni Ernst's chief of staff, who is up for re-election this year, a very competitive race. And so watching it very closely. More importantly, Joni, I'm sorry, my wife comes from a farming family. And in these times, it's been very interesting. My father-in-law, when he was a young teenager, got polio. What I didn't realize till he started talking more about being in polio and the fact he spent over a year laying in the living room of their ranch house in a iron lung is that polio was a disease that was driven by cleanliness, not by non-cleanliness. And so it hit the farming community, quite frankly, much harder than the rest of the country. And I think that's one thing most people didn't realize at the time and don't realize today. But it's been very helpful from their perspective on the whole coronavirus and how they react. I also think that's one of the reasons why they have been, especially the older rural Republicans, have been a little bit more harsh on Trump on his reaction and handling of coronavirus is because of the way they view diseases like this and how they kind of live a life that is so focused on cleanliness, both in terms of their crops and in terms of their day-to-day lives. So let me, whenever Celinda talks, I always end up saying totally different than what I planned on doing in terms of the presentation. She actually covered the rural very well. I think it's very helpful in terms of this election for me to cover a little bit about what happened in 2016 because it was a different election than this year. One of the things I'm seeing is a lot of people who thought for sure and talked about for sure that Trump was going to lose now find them saying, no matter what the data is, that he's going to win, that they think somehow he's going to pull it out. The reality is that 2016 was very unique. It was the first time in the history of our country that a nominee for either party was over 50% unfavorable. And in the case of 2016, both candidates were over 50% unfavorable, and both candidates were over 50% strongly unfavorable. That was the dynamic that occurred all through the fall campaign. In fact, one of the things we tracked in our battleground polls was the fact that 24% of the electorate disliked both candidates throughout the entire fall. They were the swing vote of 2016. At no point in the fall campaign in any of our polling did we ever see that group of 24% of the voters give more than 20% to either of the two candidates. They remained kind of 60% all the way through. They were undecided or saying they'd vote for a third party or kind of questionable where they would vote. There is no question that in 2016, that the race moved in some of our polling in the very last week of the campaign. One of the reasons why most of the state polls were wrong is they stopped polling a week out on the Tuesday before the Tuesday election. So they didn't catch that move. So when the press went from, you said Hillary Clinton was going to win, but saw that the national polls matched up pretty closely with what she actually got in the Electoral College. And then when at the state polls, they never picked up on the fact they were kind of picking on state polls that weren't there the week that all that movement was happening. In fact, we were in the field in the last week in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Ohio, and Florida. And all five of those states went from Trump either even or behind to slightly ahead in the margin of error or winning in the case of Florida and Ohio by a big way. And all that movement occurred in the last week. The other thing that was missed in that election is that the senators running that election, we had senators running for re-election in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and North Carolina and in Florida, in all of those states. And those senators did not trust the Trump campaign to do a voter ID and turnout. And so they put that together very early. And in putting it together very early, they identified Republicans in every corner of the state, where usually what the Republican National Committee does is come in at the last minute. They set up in the suburbs. They know it's a battle of the suburbs for part of the vote, and they never identify that rural vote. So what happened when that rural vote, in fact, was doing well for Trump and then collapsed that much more for Trump, late in the campaign, the Senate campaigns were the ones that knew who those voters were and turned out who those voters were. When you look at many of those target states this year, yes, you have elections in Iowa, you have in North Carolina, but you do not in Pennsylvania, you do not in Ohio, you do not in Wisconsin, you do not in Florida. And so that benefit that was there for Trump has to be made up by the Trump campaign. Are they doing it or not? I think it's being done, quite frankly, and what I've seen more in the old way of going to the suburbs, because they keep talking about suburban women, than going to rural America. And that's going to be very important to watch on election night, what is happening in those rural areas. Celinda says they're going to close the gap. They may even close the gap even more than she thinks because of lack of turnout in those areas. The one thing I would really want to talk about is a big thing that has not been done, that was a key issue in the 2016 campaign, and that is infrastructure. One of the things that Trump hit very, very hard on in the 2016 campaign is he was going to come in and he was going to change things in Washington. And one of the first things he was going to do is go after rebuilding the infrastructure. More importantly, the infrastructure in rural America. One of the things we have found, Celinda and I, in our polling on rural America is, for example, we look very closely at millennials. That millennials, that the elite of the cities, if you will, believe that millennials are staying in the rural area because they can't get out, when in fact they are in a large way choosing to stay in there. They like the lifestyle, they like to stay with the families, that's what they want, but they very much understand that because of the roads and bridges and the situation that they are in with roads and bridges, because of not having broadband, that they cannot compete with the rural areas in the cities in the same way economically, and thought that was going to put them on an even footing. But here we find ourselves in the 2020 campaign, and those changes have not been made. That is why you're seeing kind of a weakness in the younger voters in the rural areas. On the older voters, I track it back totally to character. I am of the generation that I came of age politically under Ronald Reagan, as most Republicans my age did in their 60s and even in their 70s. And there is that direct comparison of Ronald Reagan that we came to find as a man of deep character, of deep beliefs, of deep faith, and often have that kind of compared to Donald Trump, who often doesn't show that same character, the incivility, the ugliness, that in fact, many of those young people, many of those older people have moved away from him on that reason. And I think one of the things that was probably the worst thing that the Trump campaign did in this campaign is doing campaigns to make fun of the mental capacity of Joe Biden. That the older people did not react well to those spots, and obviously they were not doing focus groups to see how older people were reacting. But we all have senior moments, and making fun of that is not something that we particularly like to see of any senior, whether they are someone from the other side or not politically. The last thing I would point out is the tax cuts. And it's probably been one of the disappointments, and I would say this across the board with Republicans, that one of the things that was in the tax cut bill that we do a very poor job of doing that has a very big impact in rural America is that for the first time, we actually had tax cuts in there for small business, along with big business. That basically, if you made $400,000 or less a year, you didn't get taxed at the same rate of the individual tax cuts, which would put you at a 40% rate, but essentially didn't get taxed on the first 200,000, which put you on the 400,000 at the 20% rate, which is where corporate taxes were put. That was never pushed very hard, and certainly not pushed in the agricultural community, that those kind of numbers became very important for the farmers that were just making it ends meet, having a good income, but not having a great income. And that tax cut was actually very helpful, but received very, very little attention, particularly in promoting it in the ag community. So that leaves us where we are today. I think what to watch in the Senate races is we have seen on many of the things that Celinda mentioned that as these Senate races got past their primary, got past a focus by the Trump base, and began campaigning on the things they had done for their state, we began to see some separation from the president. And in almost every one of these states, the Senate race is doing slightly better than the presidential race. And at the end of the day, it is going to be what they have done for their state that is going to be whether or not they survive this election that looks like it is developing as a wave against the Republicans, or does this become just a wave against Donald Trump? Bill?
Thank you. I'm now going to repeat some questions for the two of you that are being forwarded to me by Whitney. And we're going to start with the first one she sent, Celinda, was 50 years ago, the rural areas used to be far more democratic. What do you think has changed? You're on mute.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. I think that the whole base of the parties have changed dramatically, and a lot of that rural vote being Democratic was Southern rural vote, and of course that was a different Democratic Party, but you've seen a shift over decades now of the Democratic Party getting younger, more college educated, more urban, suburban based than rural. But I think it was a very different, certainly in the South, a very different Democratic Party, very different time. I think also you had some Roosevelt seniors and you had the Roosevelt period instead of the Reagan period. And the Roosevelt period was a period where a lot of rural voters were very, very appreciative of all the programs that had been started there and remembered the Depression and how hard the Depression was. Now you've got Reagan voters, and I think they share a lot of the views that Ed was talking about. And in rural America, Reagan is really a hero. But that also draws a contrast in terms of style with Donald Trump. He's no Ronald Reagan.
Okay, that question came from Seth. The next one is from Allie in Virginia. I just have to wonder, Celinda, if this is our old friend Allie Webb, since she is in Virginia. The question is, and this is for both of you, how do you explain Mike Epstein's closing of the gap with his opponent in the Mississippi Senate race?
Well, since I'm doing that race,
both of you.
Let me answer first. I think a lot of it, quite frankly, was that we had very good numbers at the beginning of June. In fact, she was leading by about 14 points. We then came back in September. Actually, because he had raised a good deal of money, as all the Democrat Senate candidates had. He had raised a good deal of money, went up on the air sooner than we expected, was on the air for 3 weeks. And that's when we saw the race draw closer. But once we got back up, both in terms of getting in what I call the glide of Trump, which is about a 14, 15 point race in Mississippi, and us being able to remind people of the job she had done, that race moved up to a double digit race and has remained there. We were in the field as late as last week. And that race is, as you know, has not surfaced as one of the races being focused on as a potential win.
Yeah, not really an expert. I'm not an expert on that race. We're not involved in it. And I know Ed is. I know on our side, they think this is one of the places that could be an upset, obviously advantaged by high African-American turnout. I think this is also one of the races, while they got an early influx of money, they didn't get money until now. There's a little bit more money going their way. And if anything, this is probably a race that was, people didn't appreciate how close it could get. To me also, and Ed is a real expert on his side of the aisle on this, I think it's really interesting because I think many of the stylistic elements that work for men, honestly, and that work for Donald Trump and Donald Trump like candidates don't really work for women in quite the same way. And I think I'm really interested in the contrast, as someone who does a lot of women candidates, in the contrast between the senator in Iowa and the senator in Mississippi, because there's nobody who's tougher and ran quirkier, tougher ads than Joni Ernst, and particularly her first time around, and they were brilliant. And she carried that off in a way that voters were very, very comfortable with. But I think some voters have been uncomfortable with the style of the senator from Mississippi, because I don't think it works as well for a woman as it does for a man.
Although it is interesting, the flip side of that, if I could add, at one point I thought they picked up on it, that the more they put Espy on TV, even though he was running 3 times the TV we were running, his negatives went up. And so they were not reacting well to him in terms of the spot. At one point, they went to a spot, about the time we noticed this, went to a spot that didn't include him, but they only kept that up for 5 days and went back to a series of spots with him speaking on the air. I think that was something that supposedly, I guess they weren't monitoring in a way, but any of our races, and I would think any of the races Celinda was doing, if you saw the numbers turn that negative when we weren't running a negative spot against him, but it drove up his negatives when he went up on the air, they would be very sensitive to that.
Okay. Here's a question from Bryce on Crowdcast. And it's kind of complicated, so bear with me. Have you poll tested questions about corporate accountability or breaking up corporate control over agriculture, energy, telecommunications, etc.? His comment was, It doesn't surprise me that rural people are skeptical of tax cuts for the rich and corporations. All too often, the quote, Farm Bureau equal farmers equal rural political forecasting doesn't understand this nuance. Now, the end is a little garbled, at least for me, but I think you understand where he's trying to
I
get
get the
to.
question. And I think it's a really, really smart and useful one. We have done two sets of polling that I think are interesting in this regard. We did a poll for the National Farmers Union, which is public, and then another one for the Montana Democratic Party, and a third one for Americans for Financial Responsibility. And what we found, one, rural voters much, much more pro-regulation of banking and regulation of Wall Street than people think. And they don't think the abuses of 2008 and 2009 should be let up on. Number two, in the poll that we did in Montana, there was very strong support for breaking up the monopoly of the trail and cattle and the processing. Now, a lot of non-rural voters had to have that explained to them. It was not clear. It was quite clear to rural voters. And then what we found for the National Farmers Union is very, very strong responsiveness to co-ops and to and very great sensitivity to corporate monopolies and corporate domination. So these are big issues. Unfortunately, I don't think they get talked about very much. And the Democrats don't talk about them very much. They talk about them more in isolated state races, but not nationally. And I think we honestly miss a lot of opportunities that your questioner is flagging for a different kind of conversation in rural America that would be really unite rural and urban America.
Ed, you want to
I
say
would just agree. We see it all through the data in terms of anti-corporation, anti-big farm corporations. And it's sitting there waiting to be used. The problem is that coming up with the money to run that campaign versus the money they would generate to counter that campaign, you're kind of playing a little bit with fire. And I think most people kind of understand that instead of making the situation better, they in fact could make the situation worse. The one thing that I did see some real pushback on it was there was a discussion going on when soybean prices dropped so much because of the trade deficit or what was happening in the trade fight, that some of the banks, and this was particularly more in the deep South as opposed to the Midwest, but a lot of the banks saying, we don't know if we can fund your seeds for the next year or your product for the next year because of what has not occurred, has been fixed this year. And there seemed to be some real resentment that they looked like they were jumping out on them very, very quickly.
Okay. This is from Maggie King on Crowdcast. How are political ideas and policies such as the Green New Deal and Medicare for All polling in the rural areas?
Linda?
Interesting question because neither one is very well defined. And I think in both cases, honestly, the opposition is defining them faster than the proponents are. So Green New Deal, the name is great. If you define it as clean energy, investment in renewables, et cetera, it's very, very popular. If you say you're going to do away with cows, it's very unpopular. So it really depends on how you define it. And I think it was a concept that we haven't been aggressive enough about defining. And the people that have been the most persuasive in defining it have been Fox News, actually. And even more than partisanship, your opinion on Green New Deal is very highly correlated with how much Fox you watch. In terms of Medicare for All, that's another case where people don't know the definition. Now, people in rural areas are often on very, very high premium and deductible plans. And so there is real concern about the healthcare costs. But a lot of people on Medicare, too, and don't want to put pressure on the system. So, again, it depends on how you define it. The Biden plan of keeping private insurance but having an affordable public plan and keeping protections for pre-existing conditions, quite popular in rural areas. But it depends a lot on how you define these issues, whether people support them or not.
And the only thing I would add is until these plans come in with a very definitive way to define what it's going to mean for rural hospitals, which are very much under stress right now, it's not going to get much attention. It gets some, but not much attention, because that has to be part of the solution, not the simplistic just Medicare for all.
Thank you. This next one comes from Adam via YouTube.
Add one thing on that.
Yeah.
What I think the thing about the Senate races is you notice that Democratic and Republican Senate candidates are running, Ed is absolutely right, running a lot of ads on rural hospitals. So it's disputed terrain about who's doing what to rural hospitals, but he's absolutely right about the salience of it.
Agreed. This is from Adam via YouTube. In terms of voter participation, mail-in voting and early voting are a bigger story than ever. What do we know, if anything, about rural trends on these? Could they impact what we see next week? I want you to know, Ed, I just got an email from Joni Ernst.
Good.
I
did too. The vote's going to be at 7:30 tonight on the Justice. Those are the type of things you get an analysis after the fact as opposed to beforehand. Okay. What I will say is two things. One is we have consistently, as much as they talk about higher turnout this year, higher turnout last year, the one best measurement is turnout compared to eligible adults. That does shift and sometimes accounts for some of the shift of turnout. In non-presidential years, we have consistently been 40% of eligible voters vote. In presidential years, 60% vote. As much as there was talk of 2018 being at a presidential level, it was higher, but it was at 50%. It was halfway between normal off-year presidential, non-presidential year vote and presidential year vote. So we saw it higher. What we've also seen in our polling is that the response to definitely going to vote or extremely likely to vote, we're getting the higher responses we've ever gotten in our polling. And in our last battleground poll we did in September, we had 81% say that they were extremely likely to vote. And there was very little difference, not only between Republicans who are at 82% and Democrats who are at 81%, but independents were at 79%. And that's going to make it very interesting on how much that overrides the activities of both parties that are very much geared at the partisan vote and not that independent vote. And I think we're going to see highest ever in terms of percentage turnout. We're far north of 50 million already voting early. And I think we're going to see that by election day be somewhere around 75 million. And my predictions are we had 131 million vote 4 years ago. I think we're going to be somewhere between 150 million and 160 million. It's going to be that much of an increase this time around.
That's 40 million more voters.
Right.
Or 35. All right. These are the last two questions. The first one comes from 100 rural women on Crowdcast. And Celinda, you did address this in your opening remarks, but maybe you might want to sort of sum it up. And that is, where do you see the rural women's vote heading this election? And then the last one is from Tim from Tennessee. How is the rural vote looking in the key states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania? So those are the last two. I'll let each of you speak, and then I'll sort of say goodbye and let Whitney take over.
Great, thanks. So in terms of the women's vote, in the rural vote in 2016, we didn't have much of a gender gap. Rural men and women voted pretty solidly against the Democrats. You are seeing some gender gap this time, and you're also seeing it particularly among senior women. So you are seeing some gender gap there, women voting more Democratic. They're still going to vote for Trump, but the margin is closing. And Ed said it really well in terms of women are voting healthcare in the rural areas and Social Security, and they're also voting leadership style, and really troubled by Trump's approach to things. In terms of the rural vote in those key swing states, they've been a target. The Biden campaign has geared a lot of media to them. The railway tour was a rural railroad tour. They've run veterans ads, including the Losers and Suckers ad. They've run economic plan. They run faith ads. So there has been a Social Security and Medicare they're running now. So there's been they're definitely battling those three swing states. The rural vote is definitely part of the calculation.
Last word.
I would just say the same thing as Linda, and we're seeing it so definite that there is a gender gap with the women. It is very definitely the older women who are responding to that, and I think for the very reasons that both of us have spelled out. In terms of the three states, you almost have to handle the three very differently. Although there's one thing that we have seen in both Michigan and in Wisconsin, and that's that we ended up at the end of September with Biden having a lot more cash on hand and continuing to raise money than the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign did something that I thought was a strategic move, which was to move money out of those marginal target states and put them into the must-win target states. That I thought was a smart move, as long as they were able to solidify that vote and then to move back to those states and start spending money at the level they should. That never happened. And in fact, the best story I can tell is in Wisconsin, where we've always handled the Green Bay market in Wisconsin. I've done a lot of polling and campaigns in Wisconsin. The Green Bay market is a very late decider market. It is also very rural in terms of the vote. It is an area that we have to win by 55-45 to come out even statewide in a campaign. And they pulled that money earlier than any place and never really got back in there. We're actually showing Trump down by a double-digit margin as of through this weekend. And I think a lot of it is because he never got back on track of competing with that vote that is there. I don't consider Wisconsin to be a state the way it's being talked about in the media. Michigan had a much different issue, and that was the African-American community turned out in 2016 at very, very low levels. So while they may not have gone as heavily after, and I think they did some, the Michigan rural areas, their campaign was all about going after the suburbs and the cities and really driving that vote up there. And as of last week, they were reporting some kind of question on did they get the type of intensity they needed in Michigan. But quite frankly, it was a very, very close race, and any kind of a shift in terms of turnout in those areas, as long as the other areas stay the same, it pretty much takes Michigan out of the mix. And I took that, quite frankly, out of the mix even earlier than Wisconsin. Iowa is an interesting state in that not only do you have, it's a state unlike, let me compare it to North Carolina, where North Carolina, the senator is running a point or two behind Trump, so he needs Trump to win. In Iowa, Joni runs a point or two ahead of the president, so all she needs is for him to bring it close. And we've spent a great deal of time in the western part of the state. That's definitely been a major battleground there. One of the interesting kind of give and takes, sometimes you see a big difference between the people that lives with that campaign every day and the campaign consultants. One of the advantages we have as Republicans in Iowa is that Grassley was a farmer, and Grassley is very popular with the farmers. And Grassley, who is very close to Joni, came in and said, I'm going to do a spot for you. We taped the spot, but the outside consultants were, okay, put it on the bookshelf. And my wife and Joni was, no, that spot is running. And that is when the campaign actually shifted from very close to ahead by a couple of points. And I think it was very much the rural area. And I think it was very much understanding that that in Iowa, Grassley's name is golden.
Okay, I'd like to just say thanks to the both of you for giving so much time to this. I know for the three of us, rural America is a passion. We thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you today. Whitney, I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. You're welcome to hang around and listen to these housekeeping missives I'm going to give. But first, I want to thank you so much for having this incredible conversation. It really demonstrated, I think, the civility and the desire for informed and thoughtful conversation that you all were hoping to have. The point of Rural Assembly Everywhere, of course, is to inspire, inform, entertain, and demonstrate. And I feel like this conversation has done all those things, particularly the demonstration around civil conversation and discourse. So thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone, I'm Whitney Kimball-Coe. I'm the director of the Rural Assembly, and I'm so grateful to you for choosing to spend some of your Monday with us. We had a jam-packed 2-hour session just now. We call that our main stage session, and we'll be doing that for the next 5 days, having a 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern main stage session. Just to recap real quickly, we heard from Dr. Besser about the importance of data and how the data we mine it reflects how we value people, whom we value. We talked about the rural vote just now and heard from pollsters who've been working together, Celinda Lake and Ed Goaz, who've been working together for 30 years, which I think is really incredible and expressing a lot of mutual respect for one another. And coming up, we're still not done. We still have much more programming for you today. We're going to give you an hour-long break, however, but we hope you will choose to come back to one of our breakout sessions this afternoon. They start at 5 p.m. Eastern. We have 2 breakout sessions for you to choose from. One is going to be a deep dive into broadband and broadband disparities in 2020. It's aptly titled, We're Still Talking About Rural Broadband Disparities in 2020. And that will be hosted by Broadband Connects America. And then we've also got another breakout session for you that's hosted by SIP Culture, which is a arts and cultural organization out of rural Mississippi. Carlton Turner and his wife Brandy will be leading that session where they'll be talking about the Cultural New Deal, which if you haven't heard about it, that might be a session you may be interested in. They'll be talking about racial justice and reckoning and gender equity. There are a number of things that will be covered in that 2-hour period. So please choose one of those 2 breakouts. If you haven't registered for those, you will need to register for those, or you will need to be able to find that Zoom link. So please go to ruralassembly.org/everywhere. That's ruralassembly.org/everywhere. And you'll find the Zoom links to both of those breakout sessions. Now, maybe you've already registered for them, and in that case, you likely have an email in your inbox that gives you the Zoom link for those breakouts. If you're still up for more beyond that, then I really encourage you to hang out at our happy hour, which starts at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. It's 1 hour. And tonight, our host for that happy hour is Art Place America and Art of the Rural. Art Place America is having its summit right now as we speak this week as well. Maybe you go back and forth between both of our summits since both of them are free and both have some similar conversations happening. But we're really grateful that Art Place has decided to come over for a happy hour. They're going to help us with networking, help us unwind, and talk a bit about arts and culture in rural America. And finally, I want to tell you that we've got a jam-packed set of programming for you for the rest of the week. So please do come back tomorrow. Tuesday is going to be really wonderful. The theme is we belong to one another. And we're going to kick it off with a conversation between Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Shannon Kring and Standing Rock organizer Wasti Win Yellow Lodge. And that will be a conversation and an interview that is conducted by a reporter from Grist, which I'm very excited about. So hopefully you'll be there for that kickoff conversation. Then later, you'll hear from Krista Tippett at On Being. So if you're a fan of the On Being podcast, I definitely encourage you to tune in. That starts at 3 p.m. But the whole of the main stage starts at 2. So it runs from 2 p.m. Eastern to 4 p.m. Eastern, and then we'll have more breakouts. So there's a lot more coming at you in the coming days. I hope you'll keep joining us. Take an hour break now, and then come back for one of our breakout sessions. Have a wonderful day.